welcome everyone to the third edition of the London Spanish Book and Thing Fair, organized by La Tundra. My name is Sandra Conte. Today I got the great pleasure to present this interesting talk where we will explore the coming into being of two debut novels written by two female artists. One novel is written by Chilean author Andrea Jeftanovic. The title of the novel is Theatre of War, published in 2020. And the other novel is by Peruvian-British author Karina Lickorish Quinn. And the novel is named The Dust Never Settle, which I believe is published in October, so in 2021, so as we talk probably. And the Spanish version is under the name El polvo nunca se asienta, and that will be published in 2022. So today's talk will be chaired by the journalist Silvia Rothlisberger from Literary South. Now please let's give a warm welcome to Andrea, Karina, and Silvia. Thank you very much, and I'll see you at the end with the Q&A. Gracias.
Thank you, Sandra. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight at the London Spanish Book and Cine Fair. I am Silvia Rothlisberger, and I'm going to be the chair of this talk. And I'm going to start by introducing the novels that we're going to talk about. So, Theatre of War by Andrea Jeftanovic is translated by Frances Riddle, explores the devastating effects of the conflict in the Balkans on a family who flee to South America to build a new life. Narrated from the perspective of the young Tamara, as she tries to make sense of growing up haunted by a distant conflict, yet the ghost of war re-emerges in their new land, which has its own traumatic past to tear the family apart. Andrea Jeftanovic, can you share an excerpt from your novel?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thank you, London Spanish Book Fair, and especially Silvia, for organizing this panel. And I will read an excerpt. I can show you the cover. It's very beautiful, from Charco Press. And I will read a chapter from the first part of the novel. And the title is, I am the same age as Dad. I am the same age as Dad. He's stuck at age 9, which was how old he was when the war began. I don't want to get any older either. I want to stay with him in his 9-year-old sadness. Dad sleeps with the light on just like me. In the darkness, he says, the black trees might creep in. Dad is frightened by the siren at midday. With a mustache, officer greets him with an outstretched arm. Dad is a 6-foot-tall child, size large, with wrinkled sleeves. I am the same age as Dad. Just he's turned the same age several times. Dad always had the same nightmare. He's inside an empty train station. He thinks the hand of God placed him on the wrong platform. Dad is absent as he reads the newspaper and thinks about the war. He does the math and adding, subtracting, calculating the length of that period. I tell him to forget it. There are only tin soldiers and water guns here. He says that barbed wire surrounds his dreams. Dad is stuck in time, remembering the war. A march of boots gallops in his ears. He always carries bread in his pockets. He has forbidden me to read history books. He writes a year on his leg. He doesn't know that I had an encyclopedia under my bed and know what the date means. He takes stock on the pantry, counts the non-perishable food items, each jar of preserves, package of rice, bag of beans, lengths his list. Every day, he inventories the contents of the lockbox. I have the urge to hack that and reassure him that the war is over, but we each cry alone in our rooms. 2,457 is the number that unlovely writes on the arm that I turned today. This is the figure that sears my skin, the number of days the war lasted, all the tears that has cried. And then I will step to the other part, very short. I go forward the novel. I wanted to share other small start. I bleed when I shouldn't. Every other day, every Monday, I fill my drawers with cotton pads and gauze that I press between my thighs. That acts strange when I bleed. One of those days, he won't say a word to me. Our eyes meet at the table. They're not similar, our eyes. I think when I bleed that thinks I have bound someone. I don't want to remember having hurt anyone. I don't want bleed in his house. He about me during the days, but his eloquent silence transmits his message. I don't want any blood in this house. My body doesn't listen. It continues to rot. That is why I think I want to grow up, what I wanted to stop at age of 9. I feel bad, afraid of all. Then the date comes and the spring bubbles up from my body for no reason. I don't want any blood in this house, he says. That's all.
We're just saying thank you, Andrea, for sharing an excerpt from Theater of War. And now I'm going to introduce Karina Lickorish Quinn's debut novel, The Dust Never Settles, which tells the story of Anaís Echevarría, who left Peru, the country where she grew up many years ago. She has built a new life for herself in London. Now engaged and pregnant, she must return to Lima to sell her ancestral home, the notorious Yellow House. Throughout the novel, we jolt from contemporary Lima to the rise and fall of the Inca Empire to a civil war that devastated the nation. So Karina, can you please share an excerpt from your novel?
Yeah, hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm going to read to you from the opening chapter. Last night, the ice cream peddlers haunted me. They came to my hotel room and danced around my bed. I knew them from my childhood when I had stood in the window of Mama and Abwe's house and watched them sell their wares to the children from the houses at the bottom of the hill. They never made the strenuous journey up to La Casa Echeverría to sell anything to us. Even when Abwe tried to appease me by buying a hand-cranked ice cream maker, and when Carmen made the empleadas churn milk in the kitchen all day, my cravings could not be satisfied. No matter how much ice cream they made, no matter how many hours they worked turning over the milk, folding in homegrown lucuma or Mama's manjar blanco, what I wanted more than anything was to be like the children who I watched from the upstairs windows, playing barefoot games of football down in the avenida, or laying out glass bottles of Skittles in the sand of Los Polvos and eating their neon-colored ice pops. My primos and I were not allowed to go out and play with those children. It was not only because the armed conflicts that had begun in the highlands had by then reached the city, though the adults did worry that there might be Reds out there among the shacks of Los Polvos, resentidos who would seek to evict us. I did not understand the conflict then, did not understand the meaning of land or how history piles and piles upon itself until it cannot bear its own weight. But I overheard some of the younger staff say the war was a pachacuti, that space and time were turning over and the world would be left upside down and inside out. The high would be made low, they said, and the low lifted high. Others said this was nonsense and that they had better watch their tongues. But it was not only because of the war that we were not allowed to go down to Los Polvos. It was also because, Reds or not, they were not our kind of people. That is what the adults said, not our kind. Then the adults would try to distract us with new toys and pretty songs, or when we became petulant and said that we would run away to live in the other town at the bottom of the hill, the aunts and uncles would scoff and say, really? You want to live without food or clean water, without a pretty house and a garden or a roof over your head? Still, what I wanted was to befriend those other children whose games I watched in secret but never joined. And I longed for the men in the canary yellow outfits to pedal their carts up the hill and sell us their cellophane-wrapped, half-melted, branded ice cream sandwiches, but they never did. And so, after the many years in which I had forgotten all about them, last night, the ice cream vendors came to me.
Thank you, Karina Lickorish Quinn, for sharing an excerpt from The Dust Never Settles. So now that both authors shared an excerpt from the books, and we have kind of a feeling of the rhythm of the books, we're going to talk about the view novels and how they came into being. And it's interesting in this talk that, yes, we're discussing your debut novels, but Andrea published Theater of War 21 years ago in Spanish, and only last year it was published in English on Frances Riddle's translation. Karina, on the other side, recently published her book, The Dust Never Settles. It just came out this month. So we have two perspectives of debut novels published in 20 years apart. Can you both tell us about how the novels came into being, how much of your own family's history became part of your debut novels, if any?
Well, so yeah, my novel took 5 years to write, and then after I finished it, I sold it 2 years later. Yeah, so the novel was inspired by the death of my grandparents in Peru and the sale of their house to build an apartment block on the same land. So the premise is sort of inspired by my family, but the family in the novel is not my family. And I feel quite kind of passionate about making sure people know that. I feel kind of an ethical responsibility to my family, because Anais's family are very troubled and not entirely likable all the time. But I think there are elements, I mean, as a writer, you can't help but, I think, draw on your life. So there are elements of trauma that I experienced with my family, things like, living through the armed conflict, which obviously they did. I was living in the UK, but I visited. And I think the spectre of war hung over my visits, even though they tried to protect me from it. So that is taken from my experience. And then sort of griefs, the family in the novel has experienced a lot of grief and a lot of death. The way that grief has experienced is different, but certainly the emotion of grief is one that I drew from my own family, just through different events.
Mm-hmm. And Andrea?
Yes, my case is very similar to Karina. I am inspired in some familiar events, but the family of the novel is not my family. And it's something like an ethical issue. I like the way Karina said that. And in my case, it's very similar also to work with a trauma memory. And I think that I wanted to write related to maybe black holes around some traumas, in the sense that a narrator that didn't live the events can in a way build that memory. And I like to think that memory is a creative process. It's not only to recall the past, it's also to create create something as to understand some missing links. For example, when you come from a family or ethic from a nation with trauma, with violence, political violence, the next generation has a lot of missing links. And I think that more than the historical or official truth or official history, there's a very interesting possibility that fiction gives, that is to build more the emotional memory. And as I have read in Karina's novel, for me it was very interesting to do that with a child's point of view, a narrator that is 9 years old also.
Now that you mentioned this about the child's point of view and about writing from memory, from memories that are not yours but that you inherited, theater of war could be considered as part of the so-called children literature, or in Spanish, literatura de los hijos, in Chile and Argentina. And now that I see from reading Karina's book, even The Dust Never Settles as well, from the civil war in Peru, so this literatura de los hijos makes reference to novels or memoirs written by those who were children in the period of the dictatorship, the Pinochet dictatorship in the case of Chile, and therefore grew up in the 70s. And books were written about that period are often seen through the eyes of children, and as is the case of your novel, Andrea. So do you consider that your book belongs to this genre, to this book of literatura de los hijos?
Yeah, always these labels, like literatura de los hijos, are very complex. And I always say we shall remember that this child's point of view is very common in a different context. For example, in the Spanish Civil War, you have a lot of novels and fictions with this kind of narrators. Also, after the Second World War, there is a lot, not only Anna Frank, there is a lot of novels. So I feel more close to the idea of Marianne Hirsch. I don't know if you have heard about this United States critic. And I like more the idea of the memories and post-memories. And I don't think that literatura de los hijos has been born in Chile or Argentina or Peru in our dictatorships. It's something more present in the whole story of the way people can understand their past. So, but as we had a dictatorship, it is like normal to have this kind of narratives. And in my case, I thought of both contexts, about the Second World War, because my family is are immigrants, and they came, it's like a forced exile because of the historical events in the Europe in the 30s and 40s. And then as a child, I was born and raised under the dictatorship, and both situations are very scary. And in a way, for a long time of your life, you don't have language. I mean, the fear, the censorship, how you say censure? I forgot the word, censorship? You say censorship, yeah. And also as a child, you can imagine what is going on. You can explain, I would say, you can explain what is going on. All these kind of secrets of things that are said like in a very loud way, like between lines. So I felt very compelled then when I was an adult, and I realized I wanted to become a writer, to write about those silence. There's so many things I wanted to understand. And in a way, I did like a research to understand what happened in those different periods of history, and the way to understand my society, the fear, the silence, the hate, the violence. So I would say that I always say that we shall remember that literatura de los hijos is a long tradition in literature. more than our South Cone, I don't know, tradition, literary tradition. So, well, I would say that I feel more connected with Marianne Hirsch's concept.
So we'll go back to a couple of points that you mentioned. First about the research, and second about that you wrote your first novel to understand your own past. But I want to ask Karina first. You have described the style of The Dust Never Settles as magical realism. And when I was reading it, I could sense the influence of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but also I could sense an influence from what is known as literatura indigenista, a literature that deals with Latin American indigenous peoples, their history and their struggles. For example, in Peru, one author is Ciro Alegría. Somehow, in some parts, I could remember his writing and that history. So can you tell us about these influences?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because like Andrea was saying, a lot of these labels of different genres come from outside, right? Come from critics or come from the publishing world. And I think as writers, I certainly don't worry too much about the labels and just sort of write what I feel I need to write. But certainly magic realism definitely was an influence on my work. I mean, I went to school in England and learned the kind of English literary canon, and then only was really exposed to Latin American literature when I went to school in New York when I was 16 to 18. And the first book that really resonated with me and gave me a model for how I would want my voice to sound on the page was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Años de Soledad, right? And then, of course, I read Isabel Allende and I read Laura Esquivel. And as somebody who grew up in Britain being Peruvian-British, but only really experienced Latin American literature as an older teenager, this was a revelation to me. So magic realism has been an influence. But when I was writing this novel, I was thinking when Andrea was speaking, it's interesting because the internal armed conflict in Peru happened when I was a child. But I felt, even though I didn't know what was going on, I felt the impact of it. And as I was writing the novel, what was very conscious in my mind was I believed strongly that the roots of our conflict in Peru came from colonialism, right? There were all sorts of contemporary things that caused it, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but really these roots branch from colonialism. And I was thinking about that and the impact, the marginalization and oppression of the indigenous people in Peru. And that's where I felt the conflict kind of reverberated from. So I felt very strongly that I needed to read writing by indigenous writers. And so I did, and that had its impact on the way the novel emerged. So the way time works in the novel, which certainly Anglophone readers would say is a magic realist way that time works. It's really the indigenous Andean understanding of time as cyclical and returning, and Pachacuti, where things come to a kind of returning cataclysm. I know that Anglophone readers will read that as magic realist. It's actually indigenous cosmology. So the two certainly influenced the way the work emerged. Big influences for me were Oscar Colcharucio, Arguedas. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But it's interesting to hear you speaking about my novel because most English readers wouldn't see that. It's a Latin American reader that's going to see that. So it's nice for me to hear that and that you saw that.
Now that you were talking about the structure of your novel, I want to ask both of you, well, if you want to expand a little bit more about this cosmology, like structure style, and also in the case of Andrea, the novel is structured as a theater play in 3 acts. So how, both of you, if you want to tell us, how did you came upon the structure that you wanted to use in your novels?
Well, in my case, that's true. I really like drama structure. I read a lot of drama, of plays. I really like theater. And I thought about this, how can a child of 9 years old, the narrator, Tamara, can figure out this whole world and all these elements, so complex elements around her. And so I thought about like a playful way to try to understand all these world, all these circumstances. So I thought about the idea of like when children play, they can imagine their own family, their own country, their own neighborhood as a representation. I think when we are when we're children, we used to have these role plays, you would say. Mm-hmm. So I think in that way, and in that way, I guess she had like some elements to understand this reality with these scenes, sometimes very tough scenes, to understand the way she was growing up with these missing links, with this absence. For me, was the way this narrator can understand catastrophic loss. The only way I thought it could be possible for a girl of 9 years old is like playing something else. And through play, she was in a condition to show and to play with some events that maybe she don't understand. So it's a way to figure out the complexity of these circumstances. And it was a way also to fill this vacuum around the senses of violence, of silence, of traumatic memoirs. A way to push the stories of this belonging to a very long, a very far away place, and this very violent national history.
Mm-hmm. Karina?
Yeah, so the structure of my novel was quite tricky and emerged essentially from the needs of the story. So the chapters alternate between the first person perspective of Anais, who's going to Lima to sell this house, and then the even chapters are told from a third person omniscient perspective that I see as the collective voice of the Peruvian dead, but of course it's up to the reader to decide who they think is speaking. And that happened because although Anais's journey to Lima provides kind of a frame narrative to introduce us to the house, the stories I care more about are the stories of history. So I mentioned that I kind of felt that the conflict in Peru's origins were in colonialism, and I ended up wanting to tell counter histories that Peruvian history has tended to gloss over or marginalize, and I wanted to bring those back into the light. But to do so, I had to tell 500 years worth of, multiple stories. And how do you do that? And I decided that the way to do that was through this omniscient voice that would be able to move from story to story and from century to century in quite a flexible way, kind of dotting around time. And part of the way it does that is it follows this saint that gets resurrected, Santa Julia, who is an empleada in the casa, who falls from the balcony and gets resurrected. Don't worry, people, that's not a spoiler. That's kind of basic knowledge of kind of what happens. It won't ruin it for you. So yeah, these third person chapters kind of zoom in and out throughout time. But anyone who reads the novel will see that pretty much every chapter is written cyclically. So it starts in one place, it cycles back into the past, and then it returns pretty much to the same place and then moves forward slightly, which is entirely based in the Andean concept of pacha and how time moves cyclically, in which space and time are one thing and kind of continually revolving. So the novel is entirely based in Andean understandings of the universe, because I wanted to kind of convey this idea that the wrongs of the past do not leave us. They continue to be present until they are acknowledged and until they are atoned and dealt with, which obviously hasn't happened pretty much anywhere in the world. So kind of the structure and the content came hand in hand for me.
Fantastic. So from reading both novels, I can tell that there was a lot of research, or I think there was a lot of research put into it in the Balkans War or the Chilean dictatorship, or in the case of Karina, as you just said, like from the indigenous time, from the colonies, from the Civil War. So I want to ask about how much research was put into these novels.
Mm-hmm. Well, I continue. Yeah.
Sure.
In my case, as I told maybe in the beginning, I read a lot of fiction with this perspective, and somehow I read a lot of Balkans authors to understand more or less this heritage. Mm-hmm. And in this way, I was like wondering about the voice of the second generation after a war, after a dictatorship. So, for example, for me, it was very moving to read a book called, it was El Gran Cuaderno da Gota Christoph, or Klaus Lucas. It's also translated, the title is for a Hungarian author. And of course, I read other book that was it was an impact for me, from David Grossman. It's also like the Holocaust narrated by a child. And though also in the Spanish tradition, some books from Carmen Laforet or Ana Maria Matute. So I was wondering the way child narrators could be possible. And it was a different way to research. It was about feelings, some films, and some historical events. And in Chile, I was living in Chile, of course, but what happens during dictatorships, there's a very big silence, nothing is said. But in the 90s, when democracy came and Pinochet regime was over, there were released a lot of archives of disappeared people. So for a long time until now, we are all the time recovering materials. I don't know, it's very tough what I will say. Sometimes they're recovering bones of the like this mass murdering, and some clothes from the concentration camps. So I was asking me how these material things can transmit memory. So it was that kind of research. I love archives. I think we can read so many labels, so many different kind of information in archives. And I mean personal archives, like photos, like personal diaries. I don't know, something that came from your old I don't know, maybe a cup, glass, some clothes. So I tried to figure out about that, and then also, of course, about the theater structure. I was also thinking about that. I read a lot of Beckett, a lot of, I don't know, Sarah Kane, well, from UK. For me, she's a great author, and she wrote a lot about violence and human beings, the way violence build your own feelings. Yeah, that's kind of that's more or less about my research.
Yeah, so for me, similar, the important concept, similarly to what Andrea said, was like interrogating silences in the archive. So I went to Lima and I worked in the National Library, looking at kind of ancient old manuscripts from the sort of 1500s through to the modern day, like slave contracts, judgments and court papers where slaves brought lawsuits against the people who purported to own them, guano contracts, all that stuff. But what I was consciously always thinking about when I was reading those documents is where are the silences, where are the gaps, and what do we do with those gaps? And that's where the stories that I tell in the novel came from, is thinking about what has been left unsaid, what has not been documented. And then in terms of the research I did about the armed conflict, similarly, I read the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from Peru. I read the kind of testimonies that were given by victims. I also read interviews that were given by perpetrators. Constantly always thinking about, though, what is the stuff that has been unsaid? What is the stuff that has been withheld? And then in order to understand Pacha, which I've said was kind of fundamental, I did a lot of research on how that understanding of time and the universe works. But I was always very conscious that I wanted to read not kind of Western anthropologists, but indigenous scholars and what they have to say about the concept. I wanted to be very careful not to kind of replicate systems of power that the academy, you know, in the UK or in North America create when looking at Peru. So that was kind of what was going on in my mind during my research, thinking about the gaps, thinking about ghosts, and thinking about what has been left unsaid.
Mm-hmm. And there is in The Dust Never Settles, there is a lot of bilinguismo. Throughout the book, there are quite a few words in Spanish. I don't know if in Quechua, I think as well. Mm. So can you tell us, Karina, about the decision of how much Spanish did you want the book to have? How much Spanish would be enough for a non-Spanish speaker to still follow the story without having to look for a dictionary? Like, how was that process, those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up bilingual. One day I'd love to write a fully bilingual novel, like fully in Spanglish, but that's going to be really difficult to publish because, I mean, obviously a few people have done it, but in the UK, it hasn't really been done because, unlike in the US, Spanish speaking isn't quite as mainstream in the UK, and certainly the Latin American population up until now has been fairly invisible. You know, it's not really recognized as an ethnic group or a cultural group that exists in the UK, even though we do exist. I always felt that invisibility as I was growing up. And so it has been difficult for me to publish my work where I switch or I write in Spanglish in the UK. I think because people think that there isn't an audience for it, which really frustrates me and makes me want to write it more, almost as a sort of like political rebellion to that invisibilization of the people that I feel that I kind of come from and belong with. So it was important to me to incorporate Spanish because of my heritage and because of my love of the language. And it was important for me that the Spanish not be italicized, that it not be kind of treated as other in the text, but actually Anais's voice is bilingual, so the novel has to be bilingual and not other the Spanish. I ended up agreeing to having a glossary at the back, which originally I was against, but I came to think that perhaps the glossary could act as a kind of literary friendliness to the reader. So while my prose can perhaps be alienating for a mono-Anglophone reader, the glossary is then that kind of bridge that bridges the gap. If I had my way, I would incorporate even more Spanish, but I obviously had to be conscious that in the UK, bilingual English-Spanish speakers would be few of the novel. So I hope I reached a decent balance. But hopefully one day I'll get to write my Spanglish, but let's hope.
And for Andrea, I have one last question because I think we need to leave time for the Q&A. Okay, so I just wanted to ask about, I read it. I wanted to ask about the translation. I saw that I think that the question from the audience is about the translation. So I'm going to ask half of the question, which is like, how do you feel? Like, because obviously Theatre of War was initially published in 2000. Yeah. And then 20 years later, it came out in English. So did you feel like you were publishing a new novel? Like, oh, I just wrote a new novel. Did you feel like the novelty of a new novel from it being published in English?
Yeah, in a way, yes. And I really loved Frances' translation. I think she kept the same rhythm, the same, the images are very well done. But in a way, for me, was a new book, totally. And in the process, we had some conversations, some dialogue, and I really like the way she keeps some poetic tone, language. And but I wanted to add something of the other questions. Sorry, I forgot about the research.
Yes.
Can I add it? I wanted to tell you that I was thinking about Theater of War, this first novel, when I was very young, and it happens that I had the chance to travel to Sarajevo and Croatia and all that, all those countries. I have been there twice, or no, three times. But when I went, it was 1997 and then 2002, so was really very close to the end of Balkans War. So it was so sad to visit this homeland in ruins. Everything, all the reference, like the housing, some streets, some buildings, all was destroyed. Was for me was a very sad visit, the first one. People didn't want to talk about the war. A civil war is very hard because I don't know, maybe your neighbor, was in the other side, and also was the end of like a citizenship, because before that people used to call Yugoslavos. I think I grew up. Sorry, my mistakes. In a Yugoslavia tradition, family heritage, and after the Balkan War, they from one country become 5 countries, and in a very tension relations. So I wanted to also to write about that, and I'm still writing about that because it's not because my case is so important, but in contemporary history, it's very impressive how people can be so close from the same ethnic nation, the same citizenship, and then you become enemies. That's something I wanted to, and I'm still going there and trying to write again and again. And right now, immigrant issues are very important after the pandemic, after some totalitarian regimes. A lot of countries, like in economic emergency, we see this every day. Refugee problematics are present right now. So I wanted to think about that, and that's something I wanted to share with you. That I went there also, as Karina told, she went to Lima. I went to Sarajevo especially, and I visited different places after the war, and always reading and thinking about this historical violence. And the translation was great.
Looks like I have time for one last question. And so the phrase that we use to describe the talk is a quote that says, "A debut novel is a piece of the writer's soul in a way that subsequent books can't ever be." And at the beginning, Andrea, you were talking about how you wrote this novel to understand your own past. And in the case of Karina, you talked as well that in a way, this novel, there is a bit of it's not autobiographical, that's not what I'm saying, but there is some of your family's past. So do you think there is like a rite of passage, like something you have to get on with, like to write your first novel about that personal history so that you can move on to writing about other topics? Like, do you think that's like a rite of passage, I guess that's the question.
I think for me, probably in that, in this novel, although it isn't autobiographical, a lot of the questions I had as a person of dual heritage and a lot of the traumas I had from griefs that my family faced did come out. And it was very cathartic in that sense. I'm now working on my second novel, and it's much less based in the personal, and it's much more about my concerns I have about the world outside of me, climate change and political corruption and kind of injustices that emerge from kind of North American corporate imperialism. And it's much less about me and my history and my pains from my family. So I think that is probably a fair assessment for my experience. I don't know what Andrea thinks.
Yes, I agree. It's like a necessary movement for the following books. Maybe you need to think about those missing links, about those silence, to move to other, I don't know, possibilities, fictions. But in a way, after some other books, because, well, as you said, Silvia, this novel was published 20 years ago. And then I have written like 6 other books, novels, short stories, essays. And in a way, I think I return every time to this like main question about destruction and a specific catastrophic loss. From my mother's heritage, I'm Jewish. So both identities, the Balkans and the Jewishness, my Jewishness, has to do with this, to think about memory and about this catastrophic loss in a way. And I do believe, more than in religions, I believe in the power of stories, the power of memory. And I think also as a Chilean person, and after this dictatorship and after these different social movements that we are right now there in this, I don't know, as like a threshold, umbral. It's very hard for me to pronounce that word. Can you help me?
Which word?
Umbral in English. There's hold.
Umbral, I would say, but that doesn't mean I'm right.
I mean, we are in a moment that probably our social paradigm is changing. So I love to think about like the macro history and the micro memories. I like to think about these 2 novels, the way they are connected. So yes, the first novel in a way is always present in your life as an author.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much to Karina Lickorish Quinn and to Andrea Jeftanovic for your answers. And now I'm going to pass the microphone to Sandra, I think, who's going to read a couple of questions from the audience. And to the audience as well, thank you in case I don't have the chance to come back. Thank you so much for joining us.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Silvia. I'm going to have a quick look to see if there is any question. I've seen that you have managed to ask a few questions during your talk. So let's see. So there was one about, Karina, did you go to Peru to do some more research? I think that question has been answered. I don't know if you want to expand.
Yeah, I grew up going to Peru more or less every year or 18 months of my life. So a lot of the novel drew on memory. But for this specific kind of historical research and research to do with the conflict, yes, I did 2 research trips. One, I ended up not being able to access that much. And so I more just did research sort of in terms of being in Lima and place and atmosphere and talking to people. But I did one trip that was basically spent the whole time in the archives in the Biblioteca Nacional in Lima. Yeah, so I did 2 research trips. It's interesting though, because I'm working on my next novel now, and I'd love to be able to do a research trip, and I can't because of COVID. So I'm having to do a lot of finding ways around the research that I need to do. I need to research things to do with the Amazon River and gold mines and hydroelectric dams, and I can't go. So I'm having to use quite a lot of alternative ways, a lot of Google Maps, a lot of images, a lot of talking to academics who've been there to do research. It's tricky when you can't travel, and also when you can't afford to travel, which is another big, barrier. Getting to Latin America from London is expensive. So yeah, at the moment I'm facing that challenge of needing to travel and not being able to travel.
I guess it will be to see when you manage to publish your next novel, to see the differences between the 2 different research that you have to do, and see how that impact your work. So
yeah, it's difficult when you're a writer who writes about very geographically distanced places, because it's expensive to travel, and of course not everyone can afford to do that. So we're lucky now in the internet age, Google Maps, Google Satellite, images, videos. It's amazing the stuff you can find. I was writing about a mall that is kind of defunct now in Lima, but it was interesting that somebody on YouTube, I managed to find somebody who had posted a video of them walking around the mall. I was like, this is great, because I can't get there, but someone has randomly posted a video in the mall. So yeah, it's amazing the stuff you find on the internet. Yeah, that helps with this stuff.
Your question in the Q&A box.
Let me see. Yes, and there is a long question, so I'm gonna try to go through it as quick as possible. So Andrea, how do discussions of the book in English differ from conversations that emerge in Chile? Any surprises? And then it says, Karina, I recognize the magic realism in the novel, but still wrestle with being marked as a magically realistic novel. Example, with a nod to Gabo's Mariposas Amarillas on the cover, for example. Could you talk about other narrative influences in your work?
Wow.
It was quite long, wasn't it? I can try to I can read
yeah
it.
the first part, I would say the difference, maybe in the English version, the critic, I think in the English reviews and criticisms from the Charco Press edition, I would say that the Balkans were more clear for the readers, and I can understand that because South America is so far away from the Balkans, and I think the Chilean readers didn't, not always, but in most of the cases, they didn't see it so clear, because it's so, and there is a big Croatian community here in Chile, but I don't know why they weren't very informed about the Balkan War. So in a way, it was more read as a dictatorship novel, and it has to do with that, with the Chilean dictatorship. And what else? And also the translation is different. You know why? English language is more concise. It's more, the sentences are shorter. So I think it's more poetic in English. The whole novel is more poetic, and I read that comments in the different reviews, and I do like it a lot. It has I have been thinking about that. The different syntaxes is more synthetic, and the second part
sorry,
of the.
Sorry, Andrea. I think I'm just aware of the time. We only have
Karina, please.
1 minute left. And so I think that there was one question left that it could perhaps be answered very quickly. Is a debut novel is a piece of the writer's soul in a way that subsequent books can ever be. Any comments? So we have less than a minute left.
So we answered that one.
Oh, did you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've done that one.
Okay, sorry about that. So in that case, I don't know if you want to.
You have a question from Yvette. Yvette asked you a question, I think.
Yeah, about the cover. I mean,
show the cover, please. Show the cover.
So yeah, these butterflies, I can see the link with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. That's not where the butterflies came from. The butterflies are actually a standard, like they're a common image that the cover artist Ana Juan uses. She did a cover for the New Yorker where she had red butterflies. So butterflies are kind of her signature. There's also yellow butterflies in like Toni Morrison's Sula as well. But these butterflies didn't emerge from either of those references, although I can get the intertextuality that people will see there. So the cover, I mean, I didn't design it or choose it, so I can't kind of fully comment on the thinking behind it. But obviously the house in the novel is yellow, and the butterflies are a common symbol in a lot of cultures of the soul of the dead, right? So I think the thinking was that the butterflies are yellow because they're kind of part of the house, the dead emerging from the house and then kind of surrounding her. They sort of represent the ghosts, I think, is the idea though. So yeah, it wasn't a kind of hearkening to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but I'm sure it will be interpreted that way.
Thank you very much. And so lastly, I'd like to ask the author, where can we find your books, please?
I mean, this Waterstones, Foils, Amazon, independent bookshops, anywhere really. I mean, it's being sold in the UK and in the Commonwealth. I hope that soon it will be sold in the US, but at the moment it's not in North America. It's just in the UK and Commonwealth in all good bookshops.
Thank you.
In my case, either is in United Kingdom and Commonwealth, and in a few months will be in the United States. And of course, you can also get the Spanish version in internet. This one from Charco Press is the website of the publisher house.
That's great. Thank you so much for all the details. And so I'd like to say thank you to Silvia Rothlisberger for your collaboration. It has been a great pleasure. I'd like to also mention that tomorrow, sadly, is the last day of the London Spanish Book and Thing Fair. And so there are another 2 events that you can still attend. You can, we will put the link in the chat box for you to register through Eventbrite. And I think this is all from me. Thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to join us in this very interesting chat. And thank you all of you. All the best with your future novels and with your current novels. Thank you, Silvia. Thank you, Andrea, Karina. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.